Good afternoon, and welcome to the panel, Shaping Peace Together, Envisioning a Post-Pandemic World. My name is Asher Kaufman, and I'm the director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. Each year, the United Nations International Day of Peace is observed around the world on September 21st. This year's theme is Shaping Peace Together. In March this year, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called on all warring parties to lay down their weapons and focus on the battle against the global pandemic. While the message was intended for armed parties, the UN also called for solidarity and cooperation across borders, sectors, and generations in order to win the fight against the worst public health crisis of our time. The UN description of the theme, Shaping Peace Together, says, and I quote, "Celebrate the day by spreading compassion, kindness, and hope in the face of the pandemic. Stand together with the United Nations against attempts to use the virus to promote discrimination or hatreds. Join us so that we can shape peace together." End of quote. While compassion, kindness, and hope are notable attributes, it might not be too far-fetched to argue that they alone would not bring us to shape peace together. The world in September 2020 is less stable than it was in January 2020, when COVID-19 hit. The pandemic exposed and exacerbated structures of inequality and violence around the world, including here in the United States. The convergence of the struggle for racial justice and the pandemic have further polarized the United States, putting extraordinary pressure on communities and institutions. Furthermore, this summer, the wildfires in California have become a painful reminder that climate change continues to be the most pressing issue of our time, even more pressing long-term than the pandemic. To address some of these issues, and also to ask the more theoretical question, is shaping the future possible? We convene this panel that brings together Kroc faculty, students, and visiting fellow for a conversation about some of the challenges the world is facing on International Day of Peace 2020. With us today in this panel are Mische, Associate Professor of Sociology and Peace Studies, Catherine Bolten, Associate Professor of Anthropology and Peace Studies, Amaryst Parks, Doctoral Student in Peace Studies and Sociology, Drew Marcantonio, Doctoral Student in Peace Studies and Anthropology, and Owsiak, Kroc Institute Visiting Research Fellow and Associate Professor in the Department of International Affairs at the University of Georgia. Each panelist will start with a 10-minute overview of the theme that is relevant to his area of expertise, starting with Mische, Professor Mische, who will provide us with some conceptual and theoretical arguments to grapple with. And then we will continue with questions and answers afterwards. And the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen there. Great. Okay, so I was invited to start us off by thinking about what it means to shape peace together as a collective future-looking endeavor. So in this time of multiple intersecting crises, when our lives are disrupted and deep social fissures are exposed, futures thinking is harder than ever, and yet at the same time, it's more necessary than ever. We are failing to address so many of the Earth's desperate needs, from environmental and racial justice to the many other forms of inequality, exclusion, and violence that shape our world. But how do we collectively engage in this task of envisioning the world not yet born during this period of uncertainty and struggle? What does it mean to think about transformation when it's so hard to see from one day to the next? So one thing is clear, we can't do it through traditional forms of strategic planning. As most of us know, when you engage in such planning, usually what you do is you envision where you as an organization would like to be in 5 or 10 years. Then you determine what the intermediary steps are along the way to get there. You set them up on a timeline, you establish benchmarks or indicators to hold your team accountable for keeping things on track. However, there are many ways in which these conventional forms of planning are inadequate for our times. We cannot plan for peace in today's world from the standpoint of a single actor or organization. Even multi-stakeholder planning processes are often problematic. They imply that people with contending perspectives will in fact be able to sit down together and figure out a theory of change for responding to today's wicked problems. But what if most of our familiar theories of change just don't work in a world that seems increasingly chaotic and unmoored? Many theories of change and peace building and development interventions are overly linear. They're unilateral. They're not adequately systemic or long-term. Right now, we're not just responding to a pandemic, but to a syndemic, in which disease trajectories are complicated by social, economic, and environmental factors. This is truly an intersectional crisis, which makes theorizing or acting in response to any part of it that much harder. So we should keep in mind that for peace practitioners and scholars, interrupted time is nothing new. Upheaval, danger, and the threat of violence is the subject of our life's work. Many of our master students here at the Kroc Institute have shared their experiences with civil wars, refugees, human rights abuses, dictatorship, community or gender-based violence, environmental devastation. Students often come to us hoping for answers on how best to respond to these problems. And sometimes they're disappointed to find that academics don't have the answers. We have lots of questions, we have lots of arguments, and maybe some partial findings that may or may not be relevant to your own local context. Now, what seems new in our current moment is that we have so many contending narratives about both dangers and transformation coming from all directions. It's not just a question of people in relatively more stable contexts designing interventions for those experiencing disruption and threat elsewhere. No one is able to imagine themselves in that benevolent outsider position, helping others in crisis. Those of us positioned here in the US need to acknowledge that the international includes us, which seems silly, but we seem to have to keep saying it. The violence and inequalities and democratic failures here in the US have been brought vividly home by the events of the past year. So as a global community of peace scholars and practitioners, we need to be clear-eyed about the dangers of the moment, while at the same time weaving together the threads of possibility that things might be different. And we need to do this without letting those possibilities slip away from between our fingers. Now, this is a tall order, and some days it just seems too tall, too dark, and too overwhelming. But this doesn't mean that we can't find better ways of thinking about complex and uncertain futures beyond strategic planning. So I'm going to take you through what I think are a few pointers. First of all, we need to think not only about very good futures or very bad ones, but about multiple possibilities. So some of you who've been in this peace building endeavor for a while may remember Elise Bolten, one of the founding mothers of peace studies. Bolten was responding to the Cold War scenarios of military planners like Herman Kahn, who urged us to think the unthinkable, a future of nuclear Armageddon. Bolten designed workshops to lead people from imagining the feared future of nuclear catastrophe to the desired future of a world without weapons. Now, as a child of the 70s and 80s, I grew up with both of these imaginaries. What I've learned since then is that we have to keep in mind not only the catastrophic and the transformative scenarios, but also the many possibilities in between. Some of you may have listened to the very moving talk by Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, The Danger of a Single Story. I would add that there's also the danger of dual stories, of being caught between these opposing poles. So in my current research, I'm looking at the use of scenario thinking in transnational social change efforts, including peace building. And while there are pros and cons of this approach, one of the interesting things is that scenario practitioners insist that we need to look at not just what will happen or what should happen, but what could happen, including looking at multiple stories, surprises, complex systems interactions. Futurist Jim Dater has described 4 archetypes of scenarios, focus on growth or progress, constraint, collapse, and transformation. Now, societal collapse and transformation stories are in fact vital for our social change efforts, but they're not the only stories, and sometimes they distract from engaging with the constraints and possibilities of emerging paths forward. However, living in this imaginative in-between space is difficult and uncomfortable. How do we know how, where, or when to act? Foresight practitioners talk about being attentive to signals of change, both small and large. In more religious language, we might call this reading the signs of the times. We need to be attentive to local, small-scale, community-based possibilities for enhancing justice and healing. At the same time, we need to attend to larger scale, meso and macro shifts, including the need to reform and strengthen international institutions. We need to work for change on multiple fronts at different scales and with varying timeframes. And we need to work on not being sucked into overly simplistic progress or growth narratives. We have to keep transformation and collapse always on the horizon while working in the difficult space of constraint. So third, peace building may mean at times escalating disagreement and conflict. Peace building will not always be harmonious. Now, I have many refrains in my mind from this past year, including no justice, no peace, silence is violence, and now let's add Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I dissent. We do need to say no to the many forces of oppression, violence, and inhumanity in the world, including through contentious forms of politics and protests in the streets. We do need to keep exposing the silent forms of structural violence and inequity that often erupt into overt violence, including through our scholarly and our institutional change efforts. But we also have to be aware that we may not agree with each other on how to move forward. What some of us see as radical challenge, others see as unrealistic or counterproductive. What some see as viable institutional pathways, others see as co-optation or channeling. Now, I don't have easy answers for this. This is a rocky and uncomfortable time. I just urge us to listen to each other's insights and proposals with humility and compassion, even as we maintain the ferocity and the ambition of our struggle for change. Finally, we need to understand that in complex and confusing times, strategy is emergent and experimental. So I'm going to close by returning to some of the weakness of conventional forms of strategic planning. In my work on scenarios, I've seen a lot of statements like this, which comes from the Kenya at the Crossroads scenarios in the year 2000. Foresight experts repeatedly deny that they're doing prediction. A scenario is not a prediction. Foresight practitioners say over and over again, no one can know the futures. Futures tell us, almost like a mantra. So how do we develop strategy when the future is unpredictable and uncertain? I'm finding some clues in a book I'm reading right now by Adrienne Marie Brown, Emergent Strategy. Brown is an author and social justice facilitator who herself draws on the wisdom of Afrofuturist novelist Octavia Butler. Brown calls on us to acknowledge that our futures are fractal, multi-layered, and experimental. Our change efforts need to begin from sensing collectively where we are and finding actions that can ripple through the short term and the long term, through the local and the transnational, through many intersecting systems at once. We need to keep our eyes open, our spirits up, and our imaginations in play. So I'll just end by kind of a longish quote by Brown. She says that it's important that we fight for the future, that we get in the game, that we get dirty, that we get experimental. We have to move beyond the fears. We have to ideate, to imagine and conceive together. The more people that collaborate on that ideation, the more that people will be served by the resulting worlds. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Anne. Appreciated the theoretical and the contextual foundations for our conversation. We'll move now to Kat Bolten, who will zoom in for us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Asher. Lovely pun. Thank you everyone for attending this afternoon. What I'm going to talk about is actually not something that I work on directly in my research, but something that I do a lot of teaching on. So I am a scholar of structural violence, And what I'll be focusing on today is the domestic eviction crisis in the US that is being precipitated by the pandemic, but that obviously also preceded the pandemic, but in ways that were much more kind of silent and invisible than they are now. And by prefacing my comments by saying the fact that eviction is no longer a silent, invisible crisis is what creates the room for us to potentially have a more helpful future with respect to tenant protections and housing protections. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with structural violence, the term is basically was coined by Johann Galtung in the 1960s to refer to forms of violence that are not direct conflict and direct violence from one human onto another, but these forms of invisible suffering that are basically the result of the way that systems are structured, and that people cannot reach their full potential because of the ways that the policies and the structures that kind of order their lives consistently keep them on the bottom of the ladder. Now, what structural violence has to do with eviction is that eviction used to be in the 1960s something that precipitated the original form of welfare that we saw in the United States, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC. Which began under the premise that poverty was actually a structural condition and that people who lived chronically in poverty did so not of their own making, but because of the constraints of the world in which they lived. Lack of education, lack of steady employment opportunities, lack of medical care, and so on and so forth that would, potentially send any family into chronic poverty. In the 1990s, a sort of creeping neoliberalism, Bill Clinton changed aid to families with dependent children into a different program called TANF, Temporary Aid to Needy Families. And the idea of this shift was essentially predicated on this myth of the welfare queen, of the development of especially single mothers who were taking so much advantage of AFDC that they could successfully not work and sort of live off the bounty of the state. Now, when putting forth this idea of the welfare queen and changing AFDC to TANF, the idea was that families would be better served if women, particularly single Black women who were heads of households, got married and got jobs and could prove that they were willing and able to work more than 30 hours a week. Now, what the change also did was transform this aid from sort of long-term assistance to something that was time-limited. Families could only be eligible for TANF for a brief, limited period of time, and then they would have to prove that they could kind of work their way out of this safety net, that any safety net was only temporary. So when this occurred, the welfare queen, as defined by Bill Clinton, suddenly was forced to take her children, find daycare for them, find a job that she would have to then find transportation for, hold down that job for at least 30 hours a week. And as we know, most part-time work, which she would attempt to get because she could not spare the hours from taking care of her family, do not offer up to 30 hours. And so women were having to cobble together multiple jobs, multiple forms of childcare, multiple forms of transportation in order to provide the basic safety net to their families that AFDC had formerly provided. And this is what precipitated a kind of trickling rise in evictions from the 1990s on forward. But because of the kind of neoliberal framing of TANF, what eviction was kind of a dirty word. It's only people who refuse to make it, who refuse to work hard enough, who aren't willing to pull themselves up by their bootstraps that suffer eviction. And so it was seen as someone's individual moral failing if they were evicted and their family lacked housing. And eviction was kind of contoured by what these moral failings were. So chronic non-payment of rent was one of these things. But another more insidious form of eviction was predicated on this idea of the nuisance household or the nuisance property. So that if the police were called on tenants more than 3 times in a year, that property could be claimed as a nuisance property, and landlords would have the legal right to evict the tenants even if they were staying current on their rent. And nuisance calls aren't just, violence within the household. Noise complaints comprised a nuisance call. So if children were noisy in the middle of the day or in the evening, the police could be called on a noise complaint. Any large party could call, could result in the police showing up and a nuisance complaint being filed against the household. So that eviction became more than just, losing your house because you don't pay rent. It's a form of precarity that was particular to poor families who lacked the legal safety net as well to protect themselves against nuisance calls, and made it possible for landlords to start evicting people that they didn't like, whether or not these families were actually paying rent. And you can probably imagine how this turned into chronic structural violence of eviction against poor families, against single mother-headed households, and especially against African American families. And eviction is always a black mark on people's housing records. If you have one eviction on your housing record, any landlord can legally refuse to rent you property. And according to Matthew Desmond, who wrote the kind of definitive tome on eviction in 2015, a single eviction on a household's record means they are 5 times more likely to end up homeless, with all of the attendant consequences of chronic homelessness. Now, what changed with the pandemic? I'm sure you were all aware of how the sudden contraction of the US economy, mass layoffs, closures of businesses, and job losses in March, April, and May caused people who were till that point successfully living from paycheck to paycheck to lose those jobs by which they paid their rent. There were rent strikes that went on initially around the country. A lot of them were kind of encouraged by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other young members of Congress who were trying to highlight the fact that housing precarity is actually something suffered by a lot more Americans than had been previously thought under the neoliberal order. And the pandemic kind of shone the light on eviction as not just a kind of chronic invisible crisis of the undeserving poor, but the vulnerability of all tenants, and the fact that tenancy law favors landlords disproportionately. That protection of property and protection of landlord income is actually much more important in state law and in federal law than is the actual right to housing that people have, even mothers with children. So when the US government placed a temporary moratorium on evictions during the first months of the pandemic, it was essentially seen as a way of keeping people in their houses until the economy could kind of get back on track. But what most people don't know about this stay on evictions is that it was simply staying rent payment. It did not forgive rent payments. So the idea was that once the moratorium expired, back rent would be owed from tenants to landlords, and that at the end of the moratorium, if the entire back rent could not be paid, then the landlord still had the right to evict those tenants. So what we see is that the end of the moratorium, which the CDC has extended to the end of the year for all federally insured mortgage properties, is that we might see mass eviction occurring at the end of the moratorium, not because people are still losing their jobs or have not found new ones, but because they were unable to pay 6 to 9 months of back rent. What the pandemic also shone a light on was that in spite of the moratorium on evictions for non-payment of rent, landlords could still evict for other reasons, nuisance properties being one of them. And we found that landlords in many states started exercising this option much more frequently. But also, and this is even more insidious, for breaking the rental agreement. And there are many news outlets that are kind of shining a light on tenants who were complaining that they were evicted essentially for absolutely spurious reasons, such as someone who was not listed on the initial rental agreement living in the home, pets that were not allowed under the rental agreement being in the home, and most importantly, adult children who were not listed on the rental agreement moving back into the household because they had either lost their jobs, lost their homes, or their universities had closed. And there were many families who actually experienced mass evictions in May and June after their adult children whose universities had closed had been found living in those apartments for more than 2 months. So this was a mass eviction crisis that was precipitated not by non-payment of rent, which was made illegal under the moratorium, but for other reasons of breaking the rental agreement. So breaking a lease agreement is also, can be done with nuisance property laws that have to do with multiple noise complaints. So when primary schools also closed and children moved to online learning in March, suddenly you have all these young children who are home all day. They make noise as young children do, and that was another precipitating factor in the rise in nuisance property calls and eviction on that basis. So suddenly what we found during the pandemic was a shift in the entire narrative of the moral blameworthiness of the poor for their own eviction. Suddenly, with the pandemic, good people are being evicted too. Hardworking people are being evicted. People who had jobs that previously provided them sufficient security, and I'm not saying security, sufficient security to stay in a home, were revealed as being just as housing insecure as those that we would consider chronically poor. It lifted the lid on the number of American families that are actually living paycheck to paycheck and were just one paycheck away from being evicted under normal circumstances. That could happen to families individually before the pandemic, but what we saw during the pandemic is just how housing insecure the majority of Americans are. And so what we're seeing even in the interim, even before the pandemic is over, is a kind of light that's being shown on the fact that tenancy law has always favored landlords and puts the right of property over the rights of people to actually have a home to live in. A lot of municipalities are enacting a stay on the black mark of eviction during the pandemic. So people who were evicted during the pandemic will not have it show up on their permanent housing records and can once again get back into housing. And what it does long term is really kind of, it reduces the moralizing lens that comes with eviction or has done up to this point, and creates room to think about housing as a right. To think about having children in the house as a right, to think about the rights of tenants to, defend their lives on other people's properties, regardless of who owns those properties. And I am frankly very hopeful that some municipalities will start changing housing law as a result of this, if only because it does them no good to have so many families who have eviction marks on their records and cannot get into good, stable housing. That changing eviction law actually benefits everyone, as tenants are able to find stable housing, are able to negotiate legally with landlords in order to maintain that housing, and are able to raise their children in stable environments. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kat, particularly your concluding remark with the word hope in overall very bleak description of this crisis in the US today. We now move to Amaryst Parks, who will bring her own wisdom into our conversation. Amaryst, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amaryst, and I'm a second year in the Kroc Sociology and Peace Studies program. And I study anti-Blackness, and that's what I want to talk to you all about today. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and so many others are, quote, dead because in some white imagination they were dangerous. In that imagination, it's so respected that those who kill based on an imagined racialized fear of Black people are rarely held accountable. Hence the fact it's been too many days without justice for Breonna Taylor. As my advisor Anne brought up, Adrienne Marie Brown says we are in an imagination battle. And so I just want to take a moment to mourn and to celebrate the lives of a growing list of people whose lives were taken in state-sanctioned police violence. Thank you. The reason that I started with Black suffering was to take very seriously Michael Dumas's words, quote, that attempts to put forth a universal or more generalizable understanding of racial justice often fall into an easy multiculturalism in which the specificity of Blackness is obscured. I want to talk about anti-Blackness specifically, not only because I believe it is a fulcrum of white supremacy, but because the heightened visibility and unignorability of Black suffering is why I'm talking today. I want to make 3 points. 1, that anti-Blackness is the analytic through which we should understand this moment in racial justice. 2, that imagination is an important point for intervention and for interrogation. And 3, that we all have a part to play in the dismantling of anti-Blackness. So today I want to focus on one of the many aspects of anti-Blackness. This aspect is present in W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness, in Christina Sharp's dysgraphia, and in Saida Hartman's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. Du Bois's double consciousness is the idea that Black Americans feel a two-ness, an irreconcilable identity where one could not be both Black and American at the same time. Double consciousness is also about seeing yourself as a Black person through white people's eyes, always being wary of how you're perceived. Similarly, anti-Blackness is a distortion of Blackness. And that's what Christina Sharps talks about with dysgraphia, where anti-Blackness scrambles the image of Black people into this narrative, this caricature that is not quite human, that is beastly, and that everyone should hate and fear. Saida Hartman explains how the world still operates with the anti-Black plantation and slavery logic. When she talks of sociologists and philanthropists and poverty vultures looking at ghettos for glimpses of Black suffering, they can only see what the plantation wants them to see. Instead of seeing the beauty, the strangeness, and agency within Black life, they emphasize squalor, emptiness, and moral danger. As Hartman says, quote, "It was easier for the professionals to imagine a Black woman dead or ruined than to entertain the idea that she might thrive, that chance or accident might permit her to flourish." Hartman explains how people failed to see Black women as thinkers and dreamers and did not notice the beautiful experiments crafted by poor Black girls. Let us not make the same mistake. I think one of the most important things that we can be doing in these uncertain times is rewriting how we think about Blackness and Black people so that when we are able and when we do make material changes, we're not repeating anti-Black logics. And so many people are doing this right now. Many of my favorite scholars and artists are calling for radical changes in the ways that we think, feel, and imagine, with the expectation that these changes would manifest in the ways that we are in community with each other. This means interrogating the taking for granted, the undiscussable, what Bourdieu calls doxa, and what is fertile grounds for Black futurist intervention. When you boil it down, Black futurism is the actions and the imaginations that we partake in today to create a tomorrow in which today's Black people can be safe. And I get chills every time I say that, like Black people can be safe, where we can live in abundance and not be perceived as a threat for just being. This is not a claim to recognition, this is a claim to life itself, to all of life's beauty and ugliness, and for it to not be determined based on the color of one's skin, one's histories, or for one zip code to not determine life expectancy through racial, residential segregation and environmental racism. This is no small task. It feels fitting that the Greek word apocalypse means a lifting of the veil, an uncovering, that Du Bois called the color line, racial discrimination itself, a veil, and that Afro-pessimists and Black feminist scholars see an end to anti-Blackness as an end of the world. Anti-Blackness is so deeply ingrained in our society. This is not a naive or idealist charge to reimagine, though there is room for that. This is a call to reimagine the very building blocks of our universe. To Christina Sharp, a scholar of the longue durée of anti-Blackness, which is akin to a genealogical history of anti-Blackness, what makes it up, where we begin to tell a story. Anti-Blackness is the ground on which we stand, structuring everything from who is seen as a teachable student to mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex, food apartheid, land theft, dispossession, the list of unfreedoms go on and on. So this brings up an important question. How can imagination hope to intervene in such a deep structure? Can COVID be a moment to destabilize or dismantle anti-Black imaginations? My favorite explanation of imagination is making the absent present. To me, imagination is just being able to consider something differently than how it is currently. And rather than understanding the imaginary as unreal or false, it's only unreal in the sense is that it cannot happen in the same moment as reality. I think constantly about the imagination it took for me to be here today. How many ancestors had to wish upon a star, be it chasing the North Star, fighting for a better future for their kids, or the act of surviving. In my research, I asked young Black people in Chicago high schools to reimagine education. COVID-19 created a space to look very closely at our institutions and see how well they serve us. And though many Black students knew this before, the participants I've spoken to said the break in schooling gave them permission to consider otherwise possibilities. And it gives me such great joy to watch them draw educational communities without cops, with more guidance counselors, more representative curricula, and some of them don't look like schools at all. Some valorize Black community and Black families as educational communities. This is what imagination looks like in real time, and this is one of the first steps of creating more loving realities. As Robin G. Kelly says, quote, "Without new visions, we don't know what to build, only what to knock down. We not only end up confused, rudderless, and cynical, but we forget that making a revolution is not a series of clever maneuvers and tactics, but a process that can and must transform us. So let us dream." And now that I've talked about anti-Blackness as an essential analytic and the importance of imagination, I want to discuss how each of us are involved in imagining this world without anti-Blackness. It's very important to exercise our imaginative muscles, but how do we imagine a shared future? In our polarized context, it can be very difficult to remember that we are interconnected, that my liberation is wrapped up in your liberation and vice versa. It's time to don what Martin Luther King calls our single garment of destiny, and to use any means necessary to get each other free. To take very seriously Audre Lorde's words that we are not free while anyone else is unfree, even though their shackles may be very different from our own. The logics of separatability is one of the many ways that white supremacy keeps us unfree. We must imagine past the logics of white supremacy, an ideology and an institution that injures us all to whatever degree. And necessarily, we will all have a role to play in being and doing better. We need to question the taken for granted, question our very grid of intelligibility, how we come to know anything. We need to imagine what may seem impossible, because a world where Black people, and I mean all Black people, not just Black people who are respectable or deemed deserving, a world where Black people are safe seems impossible, but is necessary. By interrogating the terms of anti-Blackness, may we come closer to dismantling a wretched institution built on powerful lies and wicked imaginations. Starting this moment, let us dream otherwise. Ask yourself, how is anti-Blackness operating in my life, and how do I uproot it? How can I use my resources, my networks, my talents, etc., to create a brushstroke painting a world without anti-Blackness? And as I leave y'all to create these beautiful new worlds, let the words of Frank Wilderson remind you that anti-Blackness, quote, is also constructed by the violence and imagination of other sentient beings. Thus, like class and gender, which are also constructs and not divine designations, social death can be destroyed. Thank you all so much for your time and focus, and may we all have a hand in destroying anti-Blackness and building a world for us all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amaryst, for these really powerful words, powerful and imaginative words. And it is an invitation to all of us. As you were talking, I was thinking about my own personal life and the places where I could imagine and be more active. And I was also thinking about our campus. I know that you're working on a different kind of an educational system, but I was also thinking about the work that could and should be done here on campus. So thank you, and maybe we can revisit some of the points you raised in our questions and answers. We move now to a different topic and to our next presenter, Drew Marcantonio, who will bring into our conversation climate change and the environment. Drew, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Asher, and to all the panelists for the wonderful ideas that are being brought together here as we contemplate how to reshape or to influence or future cast what our future might look like and what it needs to be if we're going to have a sustainable and just future. with the ongoing pandemic in myriad newspapers, we've all been seeing evidence and stories of COVID-created emissions reductions. Everything from daily global CO2 emissions decreasing by 17%, which is unprecedented in the last several decades, by early April 2020 compared to 2019 levels. And at their peak, emissions in individual countries even increased up to negative a reduction of 26%, which is massive. Again, this has not happened in decades. Especially since the dawning of the Industrial Revolution. Similarly, nitrogen emissions have decreased by about 30%, or starting around 30%, starting about April timeframe. And I'll return to these in a minute, but just to say that these on their own are significant, substantial reductions in emissions, and they should not be discounted by the stuff I'm going to say later. All right. But there's been many articles that have come out raving about these emissions reductions and the corresponding benefits. There's even an article in a very prestigious environmental journal that COVID-19 pandemic and environmental pollution, a blessing in disguise. Like, well, really? Almost 1 million people have died of this pandemic so far. But to put that also in context, there's also been, this year, there'll be roughly about 8 million people who die of toxic pollution alone. 92% of those deaths are happening in low and middle income countries. And that doesn't even include the deaths that are going to result as a function of environmental impacts because of climate change or anthropogenic climate change, the climate change that we are causing through our emissions as humans. So over the last 6 months, there have been lots of juxtaposing signs. Is it one of benefit from reduced emissions, or is it one of decline because of what this indicates to us? So some of the positive instances, right? Maybe some of you saw the articles coming out how Mount Kenya from Nairobi can finally be seen because the skies have cleared from all the particulate matter. Or Mount Everest can be seen from Kathmandu, both of which hadn't been done by the young populations who lived there. There's only people in the very older generations that could recall the days in which you could still see those sites. Or people realizing, oh, I really don't have to make this 54-minute commute, which is the average American round-trip commute to get to work. Obviously, that was only for a small portion of the population, a white-collar population that has greater ability to adapt as opposed to those that were more disastrously affected by this pandemic. But a recognition of that is a positive thing if we can reduce those, right? So some signs are positive, but we've also seen many, many instances of concern so far in 2020. And it's important to note that none of these individual events that I'm about to name can be said to have been caused by climate change, but we can definitively say that these hazards have been significantly exacerbated and increased in frequency and intensity, right? So this pattern, as a broader pattern of anthropogenic climate change. So contribution, not necessarily causality to the individual event. But we've seen record-breaking Atlantic hurricane season that's still ongoing, right? So it's only the second time in history that you've gone into the Greek alphabet, with 2005 being the first time, and it looks like we're probably going to beat that record, which is three named storms away from where we are right now. It's also the largest number of named storms before the month of August, largest number of named storms before September. So these massive changes are very significant indicators just from the Atlantic hurricane season. Then if we look at the heat wave that hit the western US, it's the highest verified temperature ever recorded on the Earth's surface was in Death Valley this summer at 130 degrees Fahrenheit. LA set a temperature record of 125 degrees. Imagine that, a city of many millions of people living in 125 degree heat. There's been record fires, not just in the American West, as we've probably seen a lot of PR articles, but also in the Arctic. There's a fire that literally did not stop from 2019. It went below the ground, burning in the peat. The cold from the winter didn't go deep enough to put out the fire, so it continued to smolder and go back up to now the largest Arctic fire ever recorded. Some even call this a zombie fire because it went underground and came back out, didn't actually die, what have you, but it's the largest recorded fire. But also because of all the peat burning, it's also the largest amount of CO2 released from a single fire in recorded history. There's also fires in the American West, as we've seen, 42,512 fires across America as of yesterday so far, and about 6.9 million acres burned. It's on track to set a new record of total acreage burned in a single year. And that's with all of the high technology that we have now to work against fires. So think about in the past, if this had occurred in similar ways, we wouldn't have all the technology we have to try and mitigate what has already occurred. So just put that in context with it. But to go back to the emissions component, we say, wow, 30%, NOx reductions, 20-something% carbon dioxide, great. Well, the impact in total, for total emissions, annual emissions this year, so 2020, it's going to be somewhere between 4 and 7% decrease, despite the massive shifts in human mobility, economic contraction, et cetera. We're still only going to see about a 4 to 7% total reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. And that is minuscule compared to what we might think, given how much change we've seen. The indirect effect of this is of a cooling of about 1/100th of a degree Celsius, But still, on net, 2020 emissions will substantially contribute to further climatic change. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us we have to really begin to think about how we can radically retool the human niche to produce a sustainable future. Changes at the margin aren't really going to cut it for us, and then there's a substantial amount of research to demonstrate that. So how do we shape a just and sustainable future looking forward? Well, we need to think critically of the imaginary of the future. What John Paul Lederach gives us is the moral imagination, which is made up of 4 disciplines and capacities, which are held together and practiced by those who find their way to rise above violence. Today and forward, we need to rise above the environmental violence we all produce through our everyday life practices if we're going to at all have a shot at a just and sustainable peace. And simply stated, the moral imagination requires 4 things. The first pillar is the capacity to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships that includes our enemies. In this case, maybe the people who are producing substantially more than those who are not producing or contributing to net warming or net anthropogenic change at all. But we are all part of this shared Earth system in a web of biotic and abiotic parts that includes others and ourselves. We ourselves are producing this, who are creating increased rates of risk and harm to health through our consumption and resultant emissions. Turning to the second pillar, it's the ability to sustain a paradoxical curiosity that embraces complexity without reliance on dualistic polarity. This tells us that we must recognize this as a complex problem with extremely varying preferences, be they political, social, etc., for how to orient on this issue. And yet we still have to find a way to mutually reconcile these differences in pursuit of a more just and sustainable future. Unless we have full participation, this project is going to fail. And that means both domestically, also means internationally, so interstate, intrastate, etc. The third pillar, the fundamental belief in the pursuit of the creative act. We must be creative because a just and sustainable future for all people will require a radical retooling of the contemporary human niche in order to rebuild equality or rebuild equitably while promoting an ecological trajectory that can be sustained indefinitely. And the fourth and final pillar is the acceptance of the inherent risk of stepping into the mystery of the unknown that lies beyond the far too familiar landscape of violence, or in our case, the landscape of environmental violence. At least that's which I'm talking about. And this especially applies to those who contribute most to this problem, but also have the greatest power to resist the necessary changes that need to be wrought in order to prevent this or reduce this problem. But still, for all, we must expect that there will be mistakes made and that there will be friction in the process of reconstructing our human niche. But through the adaptive learning and experimentation with justness and the pursuit of a more equitable world as our moral compass or compass rose going forward, we can navigate ourselves to a new normal that, while a radical departure from our current landscape of environmental violence, will result in a substantially more optimal amount of and potential for human dignity and flourishing. That's what I have.
Thank you very much, Drew. I'm trying to find the optimistic tone in your presentation to grab into something positive and move forward. I think you left us with some serious causes for concern, but also with some ideas about, the almost insurmountable challenges that are lying ahead of us that need to be addressed. Thanks. And we move to our last speaker for this at the panel, Andrew Owsiak, who is a visiting research fellow at the Kroc Institute this year. And if you read the statement of the United Nations International Day of Peace, there is great focus on the whole idea of ceasefires, the need or the call for ceasefires, and from ceasefires, a call for greater cooperation, collaboration across borders, across communities, and so on. And it made sense to bring in this UN call for our conversation, given the centrality that the UN itself gave to this topic. So, Andrew, the floor is yours to share with us your own thoughts about it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to focus, as you heard, on sort of the UN Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. That's a rather large topic, so I'm going to break it into 4 pieces. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background or what the ceasefire plea actually entails. I'll talk a little bit then about the purpose or what the Secretary General likely intended to achieve, which I think ties nicely back to what Professor Mische talked about, the imagining of a better future. And then I'll talk a little bit about the effect, or whether the plea actually achieved or couldn't achieve its intended purpose. And then finally, I'll offer some concluding thoughts. So to start with background, Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued the call for a global ceasefire on March 23rd of this year. That statement, if you read it, seems compelling on its face. It argues that COVID is a common enemy, that it transcends nation, ethnicity, and faith, and that it promises to affect vulnerable populations more than others. This latter claim will be true everywhere, and of course we see proof of that here in the United States, unfortunately. In conflict-affected societies, what might those populations be? Well, broadly speaking, they would consist a lot of internally displaced persons as well as refugees, particularly women and children, as the Secretary General notes, each of which are at high risk for numerous reasons, not the least of which is insufficient access to adequate health care, a large problem during a global health pandemic. It's hard to argue with those premises. COVID is certainly a common enemy. It does transcend boundaries. It does affect vulnerable populations disproportionately. Based on those premises, the Secretary General then asked warring parties to put down their arms, to transcend mistrust and animosity, and to open corridors for aid. At the same time, he sort of envisioned that fighting COVID in this way would yield opportunities for diplomacy, and that parties to conflict, as well as the international community, could seize those opportunities in pursuit of greater peace. So the purpose of this call, generally speaking, is to try to imagine that better future. Building peace is difficult, and diplomats take advantage of whatever openings they have when they occur. And COVID presents an unusual opportunity, a structural one, that allows a global ceasefire appeal, if one were to issue it, to carry greater weight than it otherwise might, precisely because it affects everyone and in a transnational way. Natural disasters perhaps offer similar opportunities, but those remain localized to where the disaster occurs. Indeed, the only other systemic structural shock on par with COVID might be something like a fundamental reordering of the international system, something like the end of the Cold War. The Secretary General therefore needed to seize this unique opportunity to try something, to see what followed. And the logic underlying the appeal also has strong merit. Those in conflict can't fight each other and a devastating health crisis at the same time. They also have to cooperate in order to combat the health crisis effectively. And so therefore, COVID constitutes a common enemy. And if the enemy of my enemy is my friend, then the coordinated efforts to combat COVID could, in theory, lay the foundation for transformed relations between warring parties, or an admittedly fragile history of cooperation on which parties could continue to build. We could then, as Professor Mische says, change the narrative to imagine a less fearful future. So has the appeal had its intended effect, or could it have its intended effect? Before answering that, let me say that determining effect here carries a few complications. First, what would success look like in this case? Do we need to see warring parties actually lay down their arms, or if they at least claim to try to do so, would that be considered a win? Moreover, how long would that take, especially if it's transformative in the way that we've been talking about here today? Second, how do we attribute behavior to the plea itself? Some ceasefires that the Secretary General attributes to the plea actually arise before the plea itself, as in South Sudan. Those are easy cases perhaps to set aside, as the chronological ordering precludes the plea from having any effect on that ceasefire's origin, but it could have helped consolidate the ceasefire after the fact. The effect in other cases is going to be more difficult to discern. Are parties ceasing conflictive behavior because of the plea, because of the broader effects of COVID, or other factors like a fundamental change in their interests? And finally, those effects might change over time for numerous reasons. As an illustration, the UN and global actors generally seem to react to issues better than they proactively engage them. Other matters will inevitably arise and have, and they will accumulate in the months and years ahead, and those will demand leaders' attention. When they do, the ceasefire will fade into the background and perhaps its effect might decay. Nevertheless, it's important to consider what effect the plea did or could have, if for no other reason than to set appropriate expectations. And I'll simplify that discussion into the immediate and longer term effects. The immediate effects seem very promising, and the history there is actually very intriguing. Many non-conflict actors, as you would expect, support the call very quickly. Pope Francis, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the African Union, the European Union, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Each of these actors endorsed or echoed the Secretary General's call very quickly in March. By March 31st, 54 UN member states did the same. And then the international community sort of faded a bit. The General Assembly takes action in late June. The Security Council finally takes action in July. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Many of those in the conflicts themselves, both states and non-state actors alike, also acknowledged the call, sometimes even committing themselves at least to considering it further. And evidence of this appears in the Secretary General's update in April of 2020, just a few days after the plea. In that document, the Secretary General surveys numerous conflicts and connects them to the plea as best he can. And for example, he researches the Philippines, he reviews Colombia, he talks about Yemen. In each of these cases, the evidence suggests what we might expect. There was a lot of verbal or symbolic support, but little physical action. And that brings us to the longer term effects. Here the record seems more disappointing, but we would expect it to be. Ceasefires are often very fragile things, and warring parties frequently cycle between making and breaking one ceasefire after another for just that reason. This occurs because after fighting one another, inter-party trust is low and animosity is high. To lay down arms increases a group's vulnerability, a concern that touches on self-preservation and physical security. If we lay down our arms and the other side attacks us, will we suffer more than if we don't lay down our arms at all? And perhaps will that suffering be catastrophic? Can we take that risk? Self-preservation demands that we proceed cautiously, especially if we find the other side's promises lack credibility. Moreover, can we risk the temptation not to exploit the ceasefire to pursue a swift and more decisive victory at a time when the other does not expect us? And therein lies one of the main problems. Successful ceasefires then interfere with that logic. They deploy interpositionary peacekeeping forces to stand between parties. They find guarantors to observe and report on violations, to ensure that no party takes advantage of the other. And they build demilitarized zones. Each makes a return to fighting more costly, more difficult to pursue. In short, successful ceasefires relate to disputants' incentives. They either change those incentives directly or they follow in the wake of such changes. COVID does not really satisfy those conditions. It does not allay concerns of vulnerability. It does not increase the cost of reneging on or violating an agreement. It does not change calculations, as fighting an enemy militarily will still matter more for self-preservation than fighting the global pandemic. Where it has succeeded, I suspect that the change incentives were already in place. For example, a warring party that issues an appeal for a ceasefire in response to the Secretary General's plea likely knew that the time was right before the plea, before COVID. That plea, though, gave them an excuse, a way to appeal to a higher principle, to prevent perceptions of weakness among their supporters, and to break with past policies while deflecting some responsibility for doing so. The plea, in other words, allowed them to take advantage of COVID if and only if their interests had already changed and they needed an excuse to lay down arms. Those conditions, though, are unlikely to apply across the vast majority of conflicts in the world. So I admit that I'm not the first person to kind of take this pessimistic view, and there are others that will see that out there. I would say that one of the more disheartening things is the Security Council's response, which didn't come until July. And that represents a missed opportunity, but perhaps maybe not an important one. The Security Council seemed to stall mostly because of the United States and its insistence that the World Health Organization not be referenced anywhere inside of a resolution. In fact, there was agreement at one point by the other 14 members that the US scuttled because it contained a World Health Organization reference, just a reference to the organization itself. So that suggests that power politics are still working. But in the end, Secretary General needed to call for a global ceasefire, and it's not clear that the Security Council resolution would have changed it. Even though it was unlikely to yield progress in most conflicts, structural opportunities like this often have the ability to restructure interstate relationships. And if that was an opportunity that could be seized, we certainly had to do it, if for no other reason than to examine what could have happened diplomatically as a result of the larger global pandemic. I'll answer questions later, but I don't think I have any time left, but I'll let you move us on.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andy. I suspect that if you were given the option to write the UN proposition on International Peace Day, you would have not have focused on ceasefires. It would not been the first thing that you would write there. We received many questions prior to the start of the panel, and also many questions that kept following as all of you were presenting your giving your presentation. So first I would like to thank you really for these thoughtful ideas that you shared with us. I think we can find some common denominators among us all. I like the idea of imagination, moral imagination, because I think it is a thread that could be connected through all of your presentations. The desperate need for moral imagination and the interconnectedness of so many of the issues that have been raised here that are so central, and indeed that were central also for the UN Declaration of International Peace Day. I'll just start by reading some of these questions, and feel free to jump in and offer your answers, your thoughts to these questions. Otherwise, I will just direct the questions based on their topic. So the first question goes to you, Amaryst, about poverty. And I think, Kat, you might also be able to bring in your own thoughts on this. Is poverty a system of structural violence created through the lack of living wage? And I invite both of you or others as well to share your thoughts.
Amaryst, would you like to go first, or would you like me to go first?
I would love you to go first.
Okay, I would like to thank the questioner for this, because a living wage is actually very important. The fight for a living wage is often been called in the US the fight for 15, and that's $15 an hour as a sort of minimum living wage. So that the idea of a living wage is that no one in the US should have to work more than a full-time job, which is more than 40 hours a week, in order to guarantee that they can provide themselves with housing and food and what we would consider to be the basic necessities of life. My short answer to the question is that yes, the lack of a living wage is definitely part and parcel of structural violence, but also focusing only on the living wage would actually do further damage to the cause of reducing structural violence overall. Because if it's possible to say, well, you have a living wage, you should be able to do X, Y, and Z, then it basically lets municipal, state, and federal government off the hook to doing things like providing affordable transportation for people. The US actually has the worst public transport system in the world, whether that's within large municipalities such as New York and Los Angeles, or between municipalities. We have one of the worst rail systems in the developed world. And so we need to focus on all of the aspects by which people can actually live a decent life. A living wage is one of them, transportation another, healthcare obviously an incredibly important one. It means nothing to have a living wage if a living wage isn't accompanied by health insurance, or even better, single payer healthcare, where we would actually have Medicaid for all. Other countries like Canada, the United Kingdom cannot understand how it is that, somebody could be denied access to the hospital for not having insurance, even if they're on death's door. So we can't ensure that people can actually live to their full potential and are not subject to suffering every single day unless that livable wage is accompanied by protections for their tenancy, protections for their health, the ability to move around, and other kind of basic quality of life aspects.
Thank you, Kat. Amaryst, would you like to add, or I have a few other questions for you, which you can take together or separately. So another question specifically related to, if I can find it, yes, to anti-Blackness and its connection with the COVID-19. A question about how has the COVID-19 pandemic reinforced ideas of anti-Blackness in your mind?
This is a good question, and I haven't made my mind up about that quite yet. I think it's interesting to look at the ways that especially the movement for Black Lives, as it sort of erupted this summer, has put anti-Blackness on a different sort of stage, because it's always been on a stage, right? This is like a centuries and centuries long issue, but the special type of attention that anti-Blackness got this summer, you would think that it would lead to less, right? But I don't think that that's necessarily the case because of how entrenched these systems are. So I don't know exactly if I'm answering the question, but I would say that it's really dependent on context how you would answer the question, but I think that it's probably not a cheery story as we would want it to be.
Okay, thank you. A question about climate change and COVID. I guess a question for you, Drew. If you can speak about the meeting point of the global pandemic and climate refugees, what policies, movements are happening, and in general, enlighten us about the connection between the two.
So to date, there are no clear policies that have come out addressing the intersection of these two things, COVID-19 and COVID-19 and climate change, and specifically climate displacement or climate refugees. There's multiple different terms that are used there, environmental refugees, to all represent this. But what we see is drastic increases in restrictions on mobility intranationally and internationally, right? So within countries and between countries. We're also seeing significant increased rates of displacement. So there's greater laws to govern bodies moving and more bodies that are trying to move. And the concern being that the bodies that are trying to move might bring changes with them or might be bringing disease, specifically COVID, with them. We see this in people who've already been displaced, right? So at the Moria refugee camp in Greece that was recently set on fire or recently burned down, and all the refugees were displaced from their refugee camp. And to date, a significant portion of them have now become COVID positive as they've been exposed to the surrounding populations of Greece. But yet there's no policy mechanism or practice put in place yet to aid these individuals. Literally, most of them are still displaced, living in the open, with no place to go. We also see increased rates of internal displacement, as we talked about all the fires out west. We also see impacts of people not wanting to move because of concerns of COVID, particularly in many of the areas recently affected by Atlantic hurricanes, specifically Hurricane Laura. The organization I worked with, or that I do work with, many of the people that they responded to providing services to said that they didn't leave because of concerns of going to a shelter site and contracting COVID. So they continued to put themselves at risk or to be at risk because of concerns for COVID. So we see this playing out many different ways, but there's not been an effective or cohesive policy put out, to my mind, either domestically nor internationally, to deal with the intersection of the two. But that is certainly going to be an issue and continuing forward, because even once this pandemic's over, the concern for disease transmission, increased disease transmission, does not go away. Just COVID happens to be in the spotlight at the moment.
All right. So you see actually a need, in fact, for further research or initial research on this topic, and also, in fact, action with regards to the connection between these two that is not yet happening.
Yeah, the current rates of displacement from ecological challenges, both internal displaced persons and persons between countries, about 24 million people a year. So that's expected to be about 1.2 billion by 2050. So we're talking a significant number of bodies moving, and in concern because of the interactions or proximities between humans and broken habitat and fractured environments, increased rate of disease transmission. These two are both increasingly likely in the future, and so the intersection of them would obviously then be as well increasingly likely. So significant research and then policy intervention is absolutely necessary.
Yeah. So we received many questions about US elections and what would happen the day after or the weeks after. Anne, I was thinking about one issue that you raised in your presentation about the danger of a dual story. And it seems to me that much of the narrative now in the United States in preparation for the election focuses on this dual story. It's either or. And I wonder, this is an invitation to you or for others to reflect on this. I mean, the day after, and also bringing into mind some of the themes that that you have discussed about the need for building bridges about interconnectedness, and to think about the US after the elections in a constructive way in light of elections that seems to be really of enormous significance for the future of US democracy, US race relations. So I wonder if you can share your thoughts about that.
Sure. I was thinking, I saw that question pop up on the side. And I was thinking about, is there a way in which I can use the tools I've learned from talking to all the scenario practitioners to think about different scenarios? And if you could just do like a simple, 2x2 with, Biden wins, Biden loses, the result is accepted, the result is contested, and you get very different futures, and then also very different ways in which people have to think about what to do and how to respond, and what kinds of alliances and what kinds of coalitions to build. So let's say Biden wins and that's accepted. That's great, except that we've got another danger. The danger that we have is that lots of these challenges that have been raised by activists around Black lives and policing and racism in the past have not resulted in changing, addressing the problems. And so we've got problems of all of this energy being kind of co-opted into reforms that don't go deeply enough. And if that happens, that's interesting, because that's you've got to have mobilization to make sure that the new energy and these deeply transformative visions that Amaryst was talking about just don't drizzle away into very small, minor institutional reforms. So that takes a certain kind of, intro progressive sector challenging that has got to happen if Biden wins. So what if Biden wins but is contested? Then we've got white supremacist militias and a whole different, intensify, possibly civil war, intensify violence in the streets. That's a really different kind of coalition building, a very different kind of imagining, the kind of different kind of mobilization that we would be called to do under that scenario. If Trump wins and that's accepted, then we have risks related to deregulation, loss of rights, continued environmental devastation. We've got to continue mobilizing. So basically, in all these scenarios, we have to continue mobilizing. We have to, but probably with different strategies, So this is where the idea of emergent strategy becomes important. How do we kind of survey, the challenges that emerge in each of those scenarios? So maybe there are legal mobilization as opposed to, intra-progressive sector challenging, different forms of alliances that would need to respond in each of these different possible futures. And I think that the day after questions are interesting because you have to pay kind of deep attention to immediate conjunctural factors, but you want to do that without letting go of the overarching, orienting, imaginative vision that I think Amaryst is calling us to. How do we want to envision a world in which allows for flourishing, dignity for all, especially oriented towards those who right now are excluded from the conditions that allow for flourishing and dignity and relationality. So we want to keep this kind of ultimate, this broader, imaginative horizon, while also responding to the particular political, mobilizing, conjunctural challenges in different scenarios of what might happen after the election.
Yes, go ahead, Andy.
I think, to me, this is really interesting, especially from an international and institutional standpoint. I mean, I think the United States seems to be struggling to figure out what it wants its identity to be in the international arena. The fact that Trump seems to have so much support and the administration has pulled back from NATO, from the UN, from the World Health Organization, from things that were depoliticized is an intriguing idea. And I saw one of the questions related to leadership and institutional leadership. I think there is a question right now about who is going to lead and does the United States want to play that role? So one of the imagined things to think about future here is whether the United States wants to play that strategic role. And even if Biden wants it to do that, is the American public on board with playing that role? So you get this spectrum of support where he might have to say, well, I would really love to reach that imagined goal, but I've got to be realistic here, and I've got to say, on the other hand, I think most Americans are not at the point where the Trump administration is, which is we can't acknowledge that the World Health Organization is a good thing. I mean, I don't think most people are there, but I also don't know that they're all the way in on international institutions and law at the moment. And so I'm intrigued to see whether we kind of go back and revisit our role and perhaps figure out what we want that to be, given that we imagined this system numerous times in 1919 and 1945 and repeatedly since then.
So you're suggesting that maybe even if Biden wins the elections, that he may not try to bring the United States back to the leadership position it held in these international organizations?
I think, you know, what I love about what Professor Mische is talking about here, right, is it's not like an either or. It's not a Trump and nothing, or a Biden and we go back to, or we go all the way to the ideal. I think there's a lot of constraints that are operating, and we're going to have a gray future. It's not going to be drastic one, you know, it's not an all or nothing. And so whatever that shade looks like depends entirely on what the administration can maneuver into and what the American public and the world are willing to tolerate. We haven't even talked about the fact that the world may not tolerate us in that role anymore after the last 10, 15, 5 years, right? I mean, they may not want that.
Yes. Thank you, Andy. I'm looking at the time, and we received many more questions, but I would like us actually to conclude perhaps with one question that was raised here by one of our listeners, and that is asking us all to share with the viewers one resource that is worthy of reading or listening to or watching, as for the viewers who may want to continue and expand on the themes that we have discussed in this panel. So, Kat, would you like to start with a suggestion?
Sure. I mentioned this author and book actually in my talk, but I'll just reiterate it here. This is Matthew Desmond, who wrote a book called Evicted, on which he first really lifted the lid on the eviction crisis in the US about 6 years ago. Won a Pulitzer Prize for this book, also a MacArthur Genius Award. He's at Princeton and is running the Eviction Project through his work at Princeton, where he's constantly updating eviction stats and kind of looking at trends in eviction and trying to help formulate public policy that will actually improve you know, the work that he's already done on the housing crisis.
Thank you. Who would like to share with us? One reading, one podcast, one movie.
So I'll suggest one from the Institute for Economics and Peace. Recently, they came out with the Ecological Threat Register 2020, which is a new data project on their part to collate all things related to the environment and positive peace. So they don't just state peace, they specifically look for positive peace and trends associated with that. And so it's a new effort. It's their inaugural issue, but they plan on making this an annual report. So I highly recommend reading that.
All right.
I already recommended Audrey Marie Brown. I think I'd repeat her, but she's also drawing heavily on Octavia Butler. Go read all of Octavia Butler's novels right now. I think that's something that we need to do, because she's speaking so deeply to everything that we're going through. And I guess also there's some wonderful writing. This is not just one. Sorry, Maria. There's also just wonderful writing about Black Lives Matter and how to change America from Kianga Yamada Taylor. And I would really read everything that she's writing right now.
All right.
I guess I'll break the rules and give two. One that made it onto my list recently that I haven't read yet is related to homelessness. It's by Maeve McClanahan. It's called No Fixed Abode. It's Life and Death Among the UK's Forgotten Homeless. I don't know how great that is, but I read an article that was looking at it, and so it made it onto my book list. But the one from international relations, I'm actually going to put a plug in for one of the Notre Dame faculty here. Amelia Powell has a book on Islamic law and international law, and how Islamic law states view and see international law, especially coming from different legal traditions. And if for no other reason, I think it's really important for us to understand how different legal cultures approach international law and how the melding of all these together works or doesn't work.
Right, thank you. Amaryst, yes.
I love this podcast called The Fair, like bus fare, F-A-R-E, The Fair of the Free Child. And it's all about sort of how do we raise liberated children, free children. And especially, it's an unschooling podcast, but I think it has a lot to do with like, how do we find agency even amongst these really, really deeply entangled structures.
Yeah. So thank you again. Thank you for your participation and your contribution to this conversation and discussion. Andy, I liked the use of the word you use, the use of the color gray. This is what we may need to expect on November 3rd and 4th and the weeks to come. I'm sure that many of us in the last election cycle, the last presidential elections, were sitting and waiting for that moment where things will become clear. And I don't think that this is what we will get in this round of elections. So let's hope that that gray on November 3rd and 4th becomes a bit clearer as days go by. I appreciate again very much your contribution, and I will share some of the questions that were sent to us all, and I think we will also find ways to share the material that you shared with us now about follow-up for readings or listening, viewing. So again, and thank you all for those who zoomed in and participated in our conversation. And we look forward to seeing you again, or at least having you attend again our next virtual conversation, virtual events at the Kroc Institute. Thanks again, and have a good afternoon and evening.